Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Genesis 3, verse 19. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. This verse is the culmination of the decree upon Adam. It introduces the concept of death, the inevitability of physical return to dust, and the new reality of toil as the condition for sustenance. In both Zoharic Kabbalah and the Midrash Agadah, this verse is charged with cosmic, psychological, and redemptive significance. The first phrase we have, by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. Toil as tikkun, rectification. The Zohar interprets sweat as symbolic of the veil separating spirit and matter. Before the fall, Adam's sustenance was drawn from pure light. Afterward, it becomes encumbered by resistance. The skin, sweat, is now a barrier, a filter through which light must be earned. Bread without effort is no longer permitted. The face must sweat to sweeten the judgment. This sweat is not only physical, it's the exertion of the soul, trying to retrieve lost sparks. Bread, lechem, becomes a mystical symbol of survival, and one must now earn light through effort, prayer, and moral struggle. The Midrash links this to the idea that work is no longer elective, but required. Man no longer receives provision freely, and even his food becomes bound to anxiety, struggle, and delay. One sage remarks, even the simplest meal must now pass through the furnace of effort. But this is not purely punitive. The sweat becomes a channel of atonement. The Midrash suggests that sweat cleanses sin, making the labor sacramental. The next phrase we have, until you return to the ground. Mortality as mercy and mystery. Here begins the most profound metaphysical shift. Death is introduced into the human condition. The Zohar teaches that Adam, before sin, was garbed in garments of light, pure and immortal. After sin, he becomes clothed in garments of skin, vulnerable and finite. From light to skin, from eternity to decay. The fall casts the soul into exile within matter. But this return to the ground is not just punishment, it is correction. Death becomes a release mechanism, preventing the eternal spread of impurity. It allows renewal, reincarnation, and the eventual repair of the soul. The Midrash brings a remarkable insight. Originally, Adam was meant to live forever, but death was given out of compassion, so that he would not be trapped in a state of permanent separation from God. If man had stretched his hand to the tree of life in sin, he would have lived forever in darkness. Thus, mortality is not cruelty. It is a sealing upon corruption, allowing the soul to rise again purified. The next phrase we have, for dust you are, humility as path to return. Dust symbolizes spiritual potential in latency. It is both the lowest element and the most fertile. Because it is emptied of ego, the Zohar teaches that true ascent begins in recognizing one's smallness. He who knows he is dust awakens the light within it. This phrase is recited in Jewish funerals and Yom Kippur liturgy, not to shame, but to remind our bodies are temporal vessels, but our essence is eternal and divine. The Midrash says, "Do not become arrogant, for your origin is humble." Thus teaches humility, anchoring spiritual practice in the awareness that all glory is borrowed. But the same dust, the Midrash says, is also the same substance from which God formed man. This affirms that from lowliness comes exaltation, a core theme of both Agadah and Kabbalah. To summarize, Genesis 3 verse 19 is the final seal on Adam's curse, but one laden with mystical insight and seeds of redemption. As taught in both the Zohar and Midrash Agadah, by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. Man must now toil for sustenance. The Zohar sees sweat as a filter between spirit and matter. Bread becomes a symbol of light, and labor becomes a form of tikkun. The Midrash adds that sweat purifies sin and sanctifies work. The phrase "until you return to the ground," death is introduced, but not as a punishment only, it is a mercy. The Zohar sees death as a release, and the Midrash calls it a sealing upon evil, allowing rebirth and restoration. The phrase "for dust you are, and to dust you shall return," this phrase reminds man of his humility and spiritual impermanence, but both traditions affirm dust is not the end, it is also the beginning. From the same dust, God will one day resurrect and restore the perfected Adam. Thus, even in this darkest verse, the soul finds hope, purpose, and the long path back to Eden. That's it for today. Thank you very much for your donation. Be blessed, everyone, and I will see you on the next episode.